The fracture in Kelson's Reach's primary coolant manifold was 4 centimeters long, and, according to every certified reading the station's engineering deck could produce, already dying. Chief Engineer Boren Athel had said as much twice, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man reciting a fact he'd made peace with years ago. Stress crack, Class 3, propagating along the weld seam. We don't have a rated patch for that alloy out here. Bureau protocol is clear, full section vent, controlled collapse of the affected bay, wait for the resupply hauler to bring proper stock. He said it the way he said everything, as though the universe had already decided, and his job was only to read the verdict aloud. The affected bay was Ring 4. Ring 4 held the creche. Overseer Ilyn Dorsa stood at the command rail above the engineering pit with his hands laced behind his back, watching the diagnostic display cycle its slow red pulse, and did the arithmetic he always did before he gave an order that would matter. 41 children in the creche. 100 and change more residents scattered through Ring 4's habitation spokes. 6 hours, Athel had said, before the fracture reached critical propagation, and the section had to be sealed and vented on its own schedule instead of a chosen one. 6 hours to move 140 people through corridors built for routine traffic, not evacuation. Start the evacuation, Taven said, quietly. I don't want a stampede in the creche corridor. Nobody on that command deck noticed the girl in the maintenance crawlspace above Junction 9, because nobody ever did. Ilyn Dorsa was 9 years old and had made a private study, over the last 2 years, of exactly which grates in Kelson's Reach's aging infrastructure could be lifted without a sound, and which ones announced you to the whole ring with a shriek of old hinges. She had chosen this one because it looked down, through a service gap barely wider than her own narrow shoulders, directly onto the engineering pit where the grown-ups were deciding, in low, urgent voices, whether to let a whole quarter of the station die a slow structural death. She was not supposed to be there. She was supposed to be in her cabin finishing a mathematics module her tutor had assigned that morning, a fact her father would have reminded her of with some exasperation if he'd known where she was, which he did not, because Ilyn had gotten very good at not being known. She watched her father's shoulders set into the particular line they took when he'd made a decision he didn't like. She watched Chief Athel nod, satisfied, because the decision matched the manual. And she watched, through the gap, a woman she had never seen before walk into the middle of both of them without waiting to be invited. The woman wore a relief corps coat the color of rust, patched at both elbows, with a name stitched crooked over the breast pocket, Hale. She'd come off the human cargo hauler that had docked 2 hours ago to trade sealant stock for Kelson's Reach's surplus water reclamation filters, an unglamorous exchange between an unglamorous outfit called the Open Hand and a station too far out on the Concord's frontier to be choosy about who it traded with. Ilyn had watched the hauler dock from the observation ring that morning and thought nothing of it. Human ships came through twice a season. They were not interesting. They fixed pumps and left. I heard the word vent from 2 decks up, the woman said, and I heard the word creche from 1 deck up, and now I'm standing here wondering which one of those 2 words you were planning to use in the same sentence out loud to a room full of parents. Chief Athel did not look pleased. This is a Bureau-certified engineering decision, Ms. Hale. I appreciate the Open Hand's contribution to the water filtration exchange, but this is a closed process. I'm not asking to close it. I'm asking to look at it. She was already crossing to the diagnostic display, moving with the unbothered confidence of someone who had walked into 100 rooms where she wasn't wanted and found every time that the crisis in front of her didn't care about the paperwork. 4 centimeters, Class 3, weld seam. That the whole read. That is the certified read, yes, and the certified response is full section vent per Bureau Structural Code 11-4. We do not have rated replacement stock for a Vesariale manifold section this far out. We are not equipped to improvise a fix on a pressure system holding back 4 atmospheres, and I would remind you that unauthorized structural intervention on Concord infrastructure carries. I'm not asking permission to fix your station, Chief. I'm asking to look at your gauge. Juno Hale crouched in front of the display, and something in the way she read it, fast, silent, her eyes tracking the propagation curve instead of the summary verdict at the bottom, made Ilyn, 90 centimeters above and behind a service grate, go very still. It's not spreading evenly, Juno said, after a moment. Your model's reading it as a straight-line propagation because that's what Class 3 fractures usually do in a Vasari weld. But look at the last 4 cycles. It's slowing on the starboard edge and staying steady on the port. That's not a clean crack anymore. That's a crack that's already started work hardening itself against a stress riser somewhere in the frame behind the weld, probably that support brace 2 meters aft, the one that's been carrying more load than it was rated for since somebody widened the corridor for cargo traffic sometime in the last decade and never updated the structural file. Chief Athel's jaw tightened. That brace is original specification. It's not, and I can show you the weld pattern that proves it was retrofitted, but that's not the point right now. The point is your model is telling you this fracture behaves like every other Class 3 fracture in the manual, and it doesn't, because your station isn't built exactly like the manual says it is. Nobody's station is, after 40 years. You vent this section on the manual's timeline, you're going to be right about the fracture and wrong about everything it's actually connected to. And your alternative, Athel said, with the particular patience of a man who had heard 100 confident amateurs before, is what exactly? We have no rated patch stock. You have unrated patch stock. I saw a bin of Corvette hull plate in your cargo bay 20 minutes ago, tagged for scrap because it's the wrong alloy family for anything on your official parts list. It's not rated for this. It's also thick enough, dense enough, and close enough in thermal expansion to your Vasari frame that if I sequence the weld right and stagger the cooling, it'll hold that crack still for a week, easy, long enough for your resupply hauler to bring you the real thing. Juno straightened up, wiped her hands on her coat, and looked at Ilyn Dorsa directly, because she'd clocked correctly exactly who in that room actually had the authority to say yes. Overseer. I can have that patch welded and pressure tested in 90 minutes. Or you can move 140 people, 40 of them children, through evacuation corridors in the next 6 hours on a station that hasn't run a full drill in 3 years, because I saw the drill log on your public board and it said so. Your call. I'm not going to pretend that's not your call. Ilyn looked at Chief Athel. Chief Athel looked, unhappily, at the diagnostic display, at the propagation curve that had, now that someone had pointed it out, an obvious asymmetry he had read past 4 times without seeing. It is not a certified procedure, Athel said, to the room, to the record, to whatever report he already knew he'd have to file. I want that stated clearly before anyone touches that manifold. State it however you need to, Juno said. I'll sign whatever you want signed. I'd rather sign a form than carry a stretcher. 90 minutes later, from the same crawlspace, having missed the rest of her mathematics module entirely, and not caring even slightly, Ilyn watched Juno Hale kneel in an environment suit at the base of the manifold with a plasma welder in one gloved hand, laying a bead of light along a seam of ugly gray scrap alloy with a precision that looked, from above, like something closer to drawing than to fixing. She worked without hurrying and without stopping, and twice she called out numbers to a woman on the far side of the pit, not Concord crew, one of her own, off the open-hand hauler, who fed her cooling cycle timings in return, and the two of them moved together in a rhythm that had clearly been built over more emergencies than this one. The pressure test, when it came, held. Chief Athel stared at the readout for a long moment, and then, without any particular grace, filed a citation for unauthorized structural modification of Concord infrastructure. Because the manual required it, because the manual did not have a field for it worked. and because some part of him that Ilyn was too young to name, yet needed the paperwork to say the thing had been wrong even though the creche was still breathing recycled air on schedule, instead of evacuating through corridors nobody had drilled in 3 years. Juno Hale signed the citation without reading past the first line, the way a person signs something they've signed a dozen times before, and then she looked up, not at Chief Athel, not at Overseer Dorsa, but up at the service grate 11 feet above the pit, where a 9-year-old girl who had been holding perfectly still for 40 minutes had just, without meaning to, shifted her weight onto a bolt that gave a very small, very clear click. Ilyn froze. There was no possible version of the next 30 seconds that did not end with her being marched back to her cabin in front of her father. Instead, Juno Hale said nothing to the room at all. She peeled off one glove, walked to the base of the crawlspace access 2 junctions down, and by the time Ilyn had scrambled through the service duct in a blind panic and dropped out into the corridor below, the human woman was standing there with her arms crossed, waiting, entirely unsurprised. "You're quiet for someone in a metal duct," Juno said. "Most people your size sound like a bag of wrenches falling downstairs." Ilyn did the only thing that occurred to her, which was to stand very straight and try to look like a person who had a reason to be there. "I was performing an inspection." "Sure you were." Juno studied her, not unkindly, the same fast, complete look she'd given the diagnostic display, cataloging and done in under a second. "You're the overseer's kid." "Ilyn Dorsa." She said it the way her tutor had taught her to introduce herself to visiting dignitaries, chin level, hands folded, and immediately felt foolish for it, because Juno Hale did not look like someone who cared about the correct posture for introductions. Juno Hale. She didn't offer a hand or a title or anything Ilyn had been trained to expect from an adult being introduced. She just crouched down to something closer to Ilyn's eye level, which nobody did ever, and said, "You watched the whole thing?" "Yes." "What you see?" It was not a question adults asked her. Adults asked her whether she'd finished her modules, whether she'd washed properly, whether she understood that the overseer's daughter was watched more closely than other children and needed to behave accordingly. Nobody had ever crouched down in a corridor and asked her, with what sounded like real curiosity, what she had actually seen. "You looked at the numbers and you saw something Chief Athel didn't see," Ilyn said, working it out as she said it, because she had, in fact, been paying very close attention. "Everyone else looked at the manual's answer. You looked at what the crack was actually doing." Juno's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the shape a smile leaves behind after it's mostly finished. "That's most of the job, honestly, not being smarter. Just looking at the thing instead of the file about the thing." She stood back up, joints popping faintly, and glanced down the corridor toward the docking ring, where her ship's departure clock was presumably already running down. "You always watch through ducts, or was today special?" "I watch a lot of things." It came out more honest than Ilyn had meant it to. "Nobody tells me anything. I'm supposed to be studying." "Studying what?" "Numbers, history, the continuity charter." Ilyn made a face she didn't bother to hide, because for once nobody important was watching to correct it. "None of it is about anything. It's all what the Concord already decided a long time ago before I was born. I wanted to see something happen instead of read about it." Juno considered that for a second with a seriousness Ilyn hadn't expected, the same seriousness she'd given the fracture in the manifold. Then she reached into the deep pocket of her rust-colored coat and pulled out a small, worn stress gauge, the kind fitted to a fingertip that a technician used to feel a vibration through a hull plate before trusting a reading to a screen, and held it out. "Here's a thing happening," she said. "Put it on your first 2 fingers. Now press it flat against that bulkhead, no flatter. You want full contact, and tell me what you feel." Ilyn did as she was told, unsure what she was supposed to be feeling, until she wasn't unsure anymore, because there was a faint, steady thrum coming through the metal, so low it was almost a texture rather than a sound. "That's the recycler 2 decks down," Juno said. "Every station's got a heartbeat if you know where to put your hand. Chief Athel's been running this station for 11 years, and I'd bet good credit he's never once felt that with his own fingers instead of a readout. That's not a criticism of him. It's just a thing you can know 2 ways, and one of them's faster on paper, and the other one's the one that catches what the paper misses." Ilyn kept her fingers pressed to the bulkhead for a long moment, feeling the station breathe underneath her hand, and when she finally looked up, the question that came out of her had been building for longer than the last 90 minutes, though she wouldn't understand that until years later. "Show me what humans can do," she said. Juno Hale looked at her for a beat too long to be casual. Whatever she saw in the girl's face, hunger, maybe, or the specific starved attention of a bright child, raised inside a system that had already decided what she was for, made her crouch back down, unhurried, like the departure clock could wait a little longer than it probably could. "That's a big thing to ask a stranger in a corridor," Juno said. "You sure that's the question you want?" "Yes." "All right." Juno took the gauge back, turned it over once in her fingers, thoughtful. "Here's the honest answer, since you asked for a real one instead of a nice one. Humans can't do anything special. We don't have your reflexes. We don't live as long as a Cassar does. We don't have your species' knack for structural math. Half the polities out here think we're barely worth a trade agreement. What we've got is we're bad at leaving things alone. Somebody tells us the manual says it's over, and something in most of us just doesn't believe it yet. Doesn't mean we're right. Sometimes that gets people killed instead of saved. I've buried people because somebody didn't believe the manual soon enough. But it means when the manual's actually wrong, we're usually the ones standing there arguing with it instead of walking away." She stood, offered the gauge again, this time to keep. "That's it. That's the whole trick. You don't need to be human to learn it. You just need to look at the thing instead of the file about the thing, and be stubborn about it when it matters." Ilyn closed her hand around the gauge, like it was made of something rarer than scrap alloy. "Will you come back?" she asked, and hated herself a little for how much like a small child it sounded, and asked it anyway. "The open hand runs this route twice a season," Juno said. "Long as your station keeps trading water filters for sealant, I expect I will." She was already turning to go, coat swinging, but she paused at the junction and looked back. "Do your modules, Ilyn Dorsa, boring as they are. You want to understand a thing well enough to argue with it, you have to actually know it first. That's not your tutor talking, that's just true. But keep the gauge. And keep watching through ducts, if that's where the actual things happen to be." Then she was gone down the corridor toward the docking ring, and the departure klaxon sounded 11 minutes later, and Kelson's Reach's Ring 4 kept its air and its light and its 41 sleeping children, all of it held together by a weld of scrap alloy that was not, according to the file chief Athel submitted that night, supposed to have worked. Ilyn did not make it back to her cabin unnoticed. Overseer Ilyn Dorsa was waiting in the doorway when she arrived, still in his duty coat, the kind of stillness in his stance that Ilyn had learned over 9 years, meant he had already decided how angry to be and was only waiting for her to confirm it. "Junction 9, he said. "The crawlspace above the engineering pit." Chief Athel's second technician saw a shadow move behind the grate and thought it was vermin until he remembered, "We don't have vermin on a station this well sealed." "I wasn't in anyone's way." "That isn't the question I asked." He came into the cabin, and up close she could see the exhaustion under the anger, the particular tiredness of a man who had spent the last 2 hours deciding whether to vent a section of his own station, and then spent the 90 minutes after that watching a stranger prove him almost wrong about it. "You are the overseer's daughter, Ilyn. Do you understand what that means on a station this size? It does not mean you are protected. It means you are watched. Every person on this ring who resents a decision I make has, somewhere in the back of their mind, a very simple thought available to them. that the overseer's own child does not have to live inside the consequences of his choices the way the rest of them do. I cannot afford to give anyone that thought a single piece of evidence. I wasn't trying to be evidence of anything. I wanted to see. See what? Whether the rule was actually true. Ilyn said it before she'd fully decided to, and once it was out she found she meant it more than she'd known. Chief Athel said there was no fix. He said it like it was a law of the universe instead of a fact about what parts we happen to have on hand. I wanted to see whether that was really true, or whether it was just true for people who stopped looking once the manual gave them an answer. Her father was quiet for a long moment, and something in his face, not quite softening, more like a door left open a crack that had been closed a moment before, made her think, for the first time, that he might actually be listening instead of simply waiting for her to finish so he could issue the consequence he'd already chosen. And was it true, he asked, the rule? No, she found a stress riser nobody had logged since the corridor got widened. She used scrap the manifest didn't even count as parts. Ilyn hesitated, then added because it felt important, because it was the truest thing she had to offer him. I don't think anyone else in that pit would have found it. Not because they aren't clever, because they weren't looking at the crack. They were looking at what the crack was supposed to mean. Tavin studied his daughter for a long moment, in the too bright light of a cabin meant for a family of 3 that now, since her mother's transfer to the inner systems 2 years earlier, held only the 2 of them. You will not go into the ducts again without telling me first, he said finally. Not because I don't believe you saw something true tonight. Because the next fracture might not have a human relief hauler dock to fix it in 90 minutes, and I need to know where you are when it doesn't. He paused at the door. Finish your mathematics module, and Ilyn, when you write down what you saw tonight, which I suspect you intend to do whether I forbid it or not, write down Chief Athel's reasoning as carefully as you write down what proved it wrong. He was not stupid to trust the manual. The manual is right far more often than it is wrong. That is worth understanding too, or you will grow up thinking every rule is a wall waiting to be climbed, and some of them are load-bearing. Ilyn kept the gauge in her pocket for 11 days before she worked up the nerve to start a log. She was 10 years old, and the log was, by then, 43 entries long, kept on a data slate she'd bought second-hand from a parts vendor in the market ring, and password-locked with a cipher. She'd built herself out of a mathematics puzzle book her tutor had given up trying to keep her from finishing early. She had titled it, with the earnest gravity of a child who does not yet know how self-important a title can sound, Things Humans Actually Did, VRFID. And under it she had built, entry by careful entry, a record of every human-crewed incident she could find any trace of in Kelson's Reach's public shipping logs, trade manifests, and the handful of open-hand Relief Corps bulletins that made it as far out as the frontier relay boards. Most entries were small. A cargo hauler pulling a disabled shuttle out of a debris field 2 systems over. A relief medic human, unnamed in the official record, which Ilyn noted with a private, growing anger, stabilizing a mining crew's decompression injury with a field kit not rated for the CASAR respiratory system, adapted on the spot from notes scrawled in the medic's own hand. None of them were dramatic. All of them shared a shape, an official process that said a thing could not be done, and a human who had done it anyway, and a record that, more often than not, filed the human's name as a footnote or not at all. Her tutor, Instructor Vale, caught her working on the log during a lesson on Concord administrative history, and confiscated the slate for the rest of the session, not out of cruelty, but out of the mild, weary concern adults reserved for children who fixated on things that weren't going to be useful to them. You're building a collection of anecdotes, Ilyn, Vale said, not unkindly, handing the slate back at the end of the hour. Anecdotes aren't data. One clever weld doesn't tell you anything about what a whole species can or can't do. If you want to actually understand something, you need a pattern, not a handful of stories you liked. I have 43 entries, Ilyn said. 43 stories, a 9-year-old found interesting, is still not a pattern, little scholar. It's a scrapbook. Vale said it gently. It landed anyway because Ilyn had already begun, quietly, to suspect the same thing herself, and hearing it from someone else made it feel true in a way she couldn't argue with yet. She did not stop the log. She got better at it instead, cross-referencing entries, noting dates, tagging incidents by category, teaching herself over the following year enough of the Concord's own structural and medical certification standards to be able to say precisely which rule each entry had broken and why the rule had existed in the first place. It was slower work than a 9-year-old scrapbook, and it looked, by the time she was 10 and a half, considerably less like one. That was the same season a bureau compliance auditor came through Kelson's reach to review the citation Chief Athel had filed against the open hands unauthorized manifold repair. And Ilyn, who by then had appointed herself an unofficial student of any adult who talked about the incident at all, made a point of sitting near enough to the audit interview to listen without appearing to. The auditor was young for the rank, Cassar, silver-fronded, with a stillness to her that Ilyn found herself watching the way she watched pressure gauges, waiting to see what the stillness was actually holding back. Her name, recorded on the visitor manifest, Ilyn checked afterward with the particular thoroughness that was becoming, without her quite noticing, a habit rather than a hobby, was Reeve Calanth, Junior Adjudicator, Bureau Engineering Standards Division. The repair held, Chief Athel told her, with the flat resignation of a man who had already had this conversation with his own conscience several times. I filed the citation because the manual required it. I am not certain, in hindsight, that filing it was the correct instinct. It was the correct instinct, Calanth said, and there was nothing unkind in it, only a precision that made it land harder than unkindness would have. The repair holding does not retroactively make it a certified procedure, Chief. I have read 4 incident reports this year alone, where an unauthorized field improvisation held for the first patch and failed catastrophically on the second, once the crew that built it had moved on, and the people living with it no longer understood what they were living with. You did the correct thing by the only standard that scales past a single lucky afternoon. I would ask you not to let one working weld talk you out of that. With respect, adjudicator, the alternative was venting a section with a creche in it. I understand what the alternative was. For a moment something moved behind Calanth's careful composure, gone before Ilyn, 11 feet away pretending to study a supply manifest, could be sure she'd seen it at all. I'm not without sympathy for the impossible position you were in tonight, Chief. I'm simply not willing to build bureau policy out of the fact that, this time, the improvisation happened to work. Policy has to survive the times it doesn't. She closed her data slate with a small, precise click. Log the citation. Log the outcome. I will note in my report that the repair has, to date, held under pressure testing. That is the most honest thing. I am able to offer either the open hand or your own conscience, Chief Athel, and I would ask you not to mistake it for approval. She left Kelson's reach 2 days later, and Ilyn did not think of her again for a long while. Not until a name she'd half forgotten resurfaced, years later and several systems distant, at the head of a very different review table, and she understood, with the particular vertigo of a pattern only visible in hindsight, that she had watched the shape of that argument being built long before she ever had reason to care how it would end. The open hand hauler came back to Kelson's reach on schedule, twice that year, and both times Ilyn made sure to be somewhere Juno Hale would pass. The second visit was brief, a water filtration exchange gone smoothly, nothing to fix, Juno leaning against a cargo crate on the dock with a mug of something steaming, looking, for once, unhurried. You kept the gauge, Juno said, nodding at where it sat, worn shiny now from handling, clipped to Ilyn's belt. I kept a lot more than the gauge. Ilyn held up the data slate, a little defiant, bracing for the same tired patience Instructor Vale had given her. 43 entries, now 61, Everything I could find about human-crewed incidents in the public shipping and relief logs going back 3 years. I know it's not a pattern yet. My tutor said it's a scrapbook. Juno took the slate, scrolled through it in silence for what felt to Ilyn like a very long time, her thumb moving slower and slower as the entries went on, until she reached one, the mining crew decompression, the unnamed medic, and stopped entirely. "That was my sister," Juno said quietly, not looking up. "Priya. She's not with the Open Hand anymore. She runs a clinic on Corvassi Drift now, but that call, I remember that call. Nobody ever wrote her name down anywhere official. Compact Medical Board didn't recognize the technique because it wasn't on their approved list, even after it worked, even after they used her write-up to update the list 2 years later without crediting her for it." She handed the slate back, and there was something different in her face now, something Ilyn didn't have a name for yet but would recognize, years later, as the particular ache of being seen by someone who had gone looking for you on purpose. "Your tutor's wrong. This isn't a scrapbook. 61 entries with names and dates and rule numbers is the beginning of an actual record. Nobody's kept one before. Not like this." "Why not?" Ilyn asked. "If it's true, why hasn't anyone written it down properly?" Juno was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, it wasn't with an easy answer, which was, Ilyn was beginning to understand, the only kind of answer Juno Hale ever gave. "Because it's inconvenient," she said finally. "The Concord runs on the idea that the Bureau's manual is right, and being right is what makes the whole system safe for as many people as possible across as many systems as the Concord holds. And that's not even wrong. Most of the time the manual is right, and the manual saves more people over a century than any one clever exception ever will. But every time a story like this one gets written down properly, with a real name attached, it's a small crack in the idea that the manual's always the smartest thing in the room. Nobody official wants to be the one who writes that crack down. It's not malice mostly. It's just easier to file it as a footnote than to explain why the footnote mattered." She looked at Ilyn for a long moment. "You're 10 years old and you're already doing the thing most adults never get around to. Keep going. But keep it quiet a while longer. A kid's scrapbook people ignore. A kid's scrapbook that starts looking like an indictment people notice, and not always the people you want noticing." Ilyn did not, at 10, fully understand the warning. She understood it 4 years later, in a shipyard 3 systems over, when she watched an adjudicator of the Concord Engineering Standards Bureau read 60 pages of casualty figures, aloud to a review board, and use every single one of them to argue that the people who had prevented most of those casualties from being worse should never be allowed near a Concord facility again. Orange Shipyards was the largest human-conquered joint industrial site in the sector, and the outbreak that hit it in Ilyn's 14th year started, as these things nearly always did, as something small enough to be dismissed. A contaminated coolant batch, traced eventually to a corroded storage tank nobody had inspected on schedule, because the inspection contract had lapsed in a budget review 2 years prior, had seeded a fast-moving respiratory pathogen through 6 of the shipyard's residential blocks before anyone realized the pattern of complaints in the medical logs was one outbreak and not 40 unrelated colds. By the time Concord Health Authority declared a containment event, 400 workers, CASAR and human both, the shipyard's workforce mixed in a way few Concord facilities bothered to be, were showing symptoms, and the authority's own epidemiological model, built and validated on CASAR physiology with a human variant appended almost as an afterthought, was already producing triage numbers that Juno Hale, arriving with an open-hand relief team 6 hours after the declaration, took one look at and did not trust. The shipyard's own bureau compliance officer, a harried mid-ranked man named Ori Fenwick, who had never in his career overseen anything larger than a routine safety inspection, met Juno's team on the landing apron with a face already gray, with the particular panic of a man watching a crisis outgrow every procedure he'd trained for. Your charter permits auxiliary medical support under directorate supervision, Fenwick said, reading it off his slate like a man clinging to a rail in rough weather. It does not permit independent triage authority. I need your team's assessments routed through authority medical staff before any intervention. Your authority medical staff are running a model built for one species treating a ward with two species in it, Juno said, already moving past him toward the overflow tents going up along the residential block's perimeter. I'll route everything through them the second they've got hands free to read it. Right now they don't, and neither do you, so either help carry a stretcher or get out of the doorway. He did not get out of the doorway, not at first, and it took a physician 2 ranks above him arriving at a dead run, Sora Idrith, not yet the exhausted, indispensable presence she would become over the following 11 days, but recognizably already, the kind of doctor who cared more about a chart being right than about who had written it, to overrule him on the spot, and wave Juno's team through into the first of what would become 6 overflow wards. Ilyn heard about all of it secondhand, in fragments over the first 2 days. Her father consumed entirely by directorate logistics, the shipyard's public channels awash of contradictory casualty figures, the medical archive she'd been quietly haunting for 18 months suddenly, the only place she could find numbers that held still long enough to study. She spent the first 36 hours of the outbreak, the way she had spent most of the last 5 years without quite admitting to herself that it had become the shape of her whole life. Reading, cross-referencing, building. This time not a log of incidents already finished, but a live model of one still happening, because nobody else seemed to be building it and somebody. She had decided somewhere around hour 20 without ever consciously deciding it. Needed to. Ilyn was there because her father had been posted to Oran 18 months earlier, a promotion, overseer to deputy directorate, the kind of advancement that came with a bigger apartment and a great deal more scrutiny. And because Ilyn, 14 now, tall enough to pass for older and sharp enough that nobody thought to stop her, had spent every spare hour of those 18 months in the shipyard's public medical archive, teaching herself enough physiology and epidemiology to read the outbreaks, numbers herself instead of waiting for someone to explain them to her. What she saw on the second night, sitting in a corner of the overflow ward with her data slate propped against her knees while nominally helping restock supply carts, was a discrepancy she almost didn't trust herself to have found. The authorities' triage model was sorting patients by symptom severity using thresholds calibrated for CASAR lung capacity, thresholds that, applied to the human patients mixed in among them, were reading early-stage human respiratory distress as late-stage and vice versa, because the 2 species warning signs inverted in exactly the range the model didn't account for. CASAR patients who looked stable were, by the model's own logic, being deprioritized correctly. Human patients who looked stable to a CASAR-trained triage nurse were, in fact, getting worse in a pattern the model had no category for at all. She found Juno Hale at 4 in the morning, in a supply corridor, running field diagnostics on a portable ventilator with the particular blank exhaustion of someone on their 11th straight hour of it, and she did not waste time on greeting. Your triage numbers are wrong for the human patients, Ilyn said, and held out the slate, not by a little. The model's reading human early-stage distress as stable because it's calibrated for CASAR symptom thresholds, and the 2 profiles invert around here, she pointed, which means every human patient the authorities currently marked green is actually somewhere between yellow and red, and I think 3 of them in Ward 9 are close to needing intervention the model says they don't need yet. Juno took the slate. Read it. Read it again, slower, the way she'd read Ilyn's log 5 years earlier on a supply dock, and this time her face did not do the thing it had done then, the ache of recognition, but something harder and faster, the look of a person recalculating an entire night's plan in under 10 seconds. You built this from the public medical archive. And the last 3 years of triage protocol updates. I cross-checked it against 41 case files. I know I'm not a doctor. I know it's not certified. Ilyn heard herself starting to apologize for it and stopped, because Juno was already moving, slate in hand, toward Ward 9 at a pace that left no room for the rest of the sentence. The 3 patients Ilyn had flagged were, within the hour, confirmed by an actual triage physician to be in acute respiratory decline that the authorities' model had entirely missed. All 3 survived. The physician who confirmed it, a young Cassar doctor named Sora Idrith, exhausted past the point of caring, whose name went on the correction, filed an emergency protocol amendment that night, flagging the model's species-blind threshold error for every ward in the shipyard, and by morning the correction had likely saved dozens more. It also, within a week, became the exact kind of story Juno had warned Ilyn about 4 years earlier, inconvenient, and therefore contested. Adjudicator Reeve Callanth arrived at Orange Shipyards 11 days into the outbreak, once the acute phase had passed and the review process had begun, with the unhurried, immovable calm of a senior bureau official who had seen a great many crises resolve themselves into paperwork and did not intend to let this one be an exception. She was Cassar, silver-fronded, her eyes the pale, steady gray of someone who had trained herself, a long time ago, never to let her face show more than she wanted it to show, and she ran the review board with a precision Ilyn, watching from the gallery, technically too junior to be there, present only because her father's rank got her a seat, found herself grudgingly respecting even as she came to despise what the precision was being used for. "I want to be clear about what I am not disputing," Callanth said, on the 3rd day of hearings, to a review panel that included Overseer Deputy Ilyn Dorsa, 3 bureau representatives, and at the far end of the table, Juno Hale, present as the open hands field lead and looking like a woman being tried for a crime she'd already been thanked for privately and would now be punished for publicly. "I am not disputing that Ms. Hale's team and the correction her team surfaced prevented additional casualties. The record is not in question. What is in question is method and precedent, and what this Bureau permits going forward on Concord industrial sites." "With respect, adjudicator," Juno said, "the method was a 14-year-old girl reading a public archive more carefully than your model did." That drew a stir through the gallery, and a flicker, the first Ilyn had seen, across Callanth's carefully composed face. "Then I would ask the overseer's daughter, since she has apparently been sitting in my gallery for 3 days despite having no standing to be here, whether she holds any medical certification whatsoever." "No," Ilyn said, standing, before her father could stop her, her heart going hard enough that she could feel her own pulse in her throat. "I hold a scholar's registration and a set of case files I cross-referenced myself, and 3 human patients who are alive because nobody with a medical certification looked at the actual thing instead of the model's summary of the thing until I made them." "That is precisely my concern," Callanth said, and her voice did not rise, which somehow made it worse. "Not that you were wrong, that you were right, by luck and effort and no formal standing whatsoever, in a system that cannot function if every emergency depends on an uncredentialed child or an unlicensed relief worker happening to notice what the certified process missed. I have read the Open Hands operational history for the last 9 years, Ms. Hale. I have read every incident where your organization has deviated from certified protocol and been, as you would put it, right. Do you know what I have also read? The incidents where organizations like yours were wrong. 6 years ago, on Kesson Drift, an uncertified human relief crew attempted an unauthorized structural intervention on a failing habitat ring. 11 people died in the section they were trying to save that would have survived the certified evacuation protocol they overrode. The Bureau does not build its manual out of caution for its own sake, Ms. Hale. It builds it out of the graves of every time confidence outran competence. I am not questioning your team's skill. I am questioning whether the Concord can afford to run its safety on the assumption that every uncertified intervention will be the kind that works. The room was quiet after that in a way that was not, Ilyn understood even then, defeat. It was the quiet of an argument that had landed because it was true, or true enough, and Juno did not try to argue it away. "You're right that Kessin drift happened," Juno said instead, evenly. "I knew 2 of the people who died there. I've buried people for the exact reason you're describing. Somebody didn't believe the manual soon enough, or believe their own gut a beat too long. I'm not going to stand here and tell you the open hand is always right, because we're not, and pretending otherwise gets people killed just as fast as blind faith in a bad model does. What I'll tell you is what the record actually shows, if you read all of it instead of the 6 years where we lost. For every Kessin drift, there are dozens of orange shipyards, dozens of incidents like the 14-year-old girl in your gallery who read an archive more carefully than a validated model did, and none of them get written down anywhere that counts, because the Bureau's own record only remembers the failures cleanly. You want a system that doesn't run on luck. So do I, but the answer to that isn't banning the people who notice what the model missed. It's building a model that learns from them instead of erasing them." Calanth said nothing for a long moment, and when she spoke again it was to close the session, not to concede. The Bureau's formal finding, issued 6 weeks later, restricted the open hand's unsupervised operational authority across 3 sectors, and required Bureau sign-off on any deviation from certified protocol going forward. A ruling that would, everyone in that gallery understood, cost lives the next time a crisis moved faster than a sign-off could. Ilyn found Juno on the landing apron that evening, the open-hand hauler already half-loaded for departure. Sora Idrith standing nearby with the particular stiffness of a woman who had spent the afternoon arguing on Juno's behalf to a directorate that had stopped listening days ago. "They're citing your charter down to almost nothing," Ilyn said. It wasn't a question. She had read the finding twice already, looking for a loophole that wasn't there. "They're citing it down to almost nothing everywhere they've got jurisdiction to do it," Juno said, hauling a crate up the ramp with more force than the crate strictly required. "Doesn't mean the work stops. Means the work gets harder to do out loud." She set the crate down and looked at Ilyn properly, some of the day's exhaustion sliding off her face the way it always seemed to when she was looking directly at the one person in the shipyard who hadn't spent the last 3 days telling her she was a liability. "You did nothing wrong today. I need you to hear that clearly, because I watched Calanth try to make it sound like you had. Reading a chart right isn't a crime, whatever her finding says about what it's allowed to be called. She's not wrong about Kessin drift, though, is she?" It cost Ilyn something to say it, standing on a landing apron 6 hours after watching Juno's whole authority get quietly dismantled in front of a review board. "No," Juno said. "She's not wrong about Kessin drift. That's what makes her dangerous to argue with, and also why I'm not going to waste breath calling her a villain to you. She's trying to build a system that doesn't get people killed by confidence. So am I. We just disagree, so far, about what the safest version of that system looks like." She hauled the ramp door half shut, paused, and added, quieter, "Somebody's going to have to build the thing that proves both of us right at once, eventually. A record good enough that caution and imagination stop needing to be enemies. I don't think it's going to be me. I think it might be you, if you keep at this the way you've kept at it since you were 9. Ilyn's log, by then, ran to over 400 entries. None of them were cited in the Bureau's final report. She asked her father that night, in the too-quiet apartment that came with his new rank, why the truth of what had happened mattered so much less than the shape the Bureau needed it to have, and Ilyn Dorsa, who had spent the hearing mostly silent, mostly watching his daughter with an expression she couldn't read, did not give her a comforting answer. "Because the Bureau isn't wrong that Kessin drift happened," he said, "and because your record, as good as it is still a girl's private log. It isn't official. It isn't cited. It isn't, to anyone who wasn't in that gallery, real in the way the Bureau's report is real. You can be right, Ilyn, and still lose, if the only place your rightness lives is a data slate nobody with authority has ever been required to read. Then I'll make them read it. Tavin looked at his daughter for a long moment, 14 years old, furious, exhausted, entirely unwilling to let the injustice of the last 3 weeks settle into the shape adults kept trying to give it. And something in his face shifted, the beginning of a decision he wouldn't finish making for another 2 years. Then you'd better learn to be an archivist instead of a scholar with a hobby, he said. A scholar collects what interests her. An archivist builds a record that survives her, that other people are forced to reckon with whether they want to or not. It's slower. It's a great deal less satisfying. It is also the only kind of true that outlives a bureau finding. Ilyn was 15 when the Bureau came for the record itself, and it did not come as a raid or a confrontation, because the Concord had long ago learned that the most effective way to end an inconvenient thing was never to attack it directly. It came as a memorandum. Directive 41C, Data Aggregation and Personnel Privacy Standards, had been drafted 6 systems away by an office that had never heard of Kelson's Reach or Oran shipyards, in response to an entirely unrelated scandal involving a trade consortium that had been quietly compiling movement data on Concord citizens for resale. It was, on its face, a reasonable rule. Any private citizen compiling incident data that named certified Bureau personnel, without that personnel's documented consent, was in violation of Concord Personnel Privacy Statute 9-2 and required to surrender the material for review. It traveled down 11 layers of directorate administration before it landed, as a single flagged line item, on the queue of a newly transferred compliance officer in the Frontier Division named Den Osk, who read the cross-sector anomalous intervention records public index, saw 608 entries naming 411 individuals who had never signed a consent form in their lives, and did, with evident satisfaction, exactly what the directive told him to do. He found Ilyn at her archive station on a station cycle like any other, and set a formal notice on the display in front of her with the particular care of a man who believed he was finally about to matter to someone. Archivist Dorsa, under Directive 41C, you are required to surrender your private data compilation, currently designated the cross-sector anomalous intervention record, for compliance review, and to cease further aggregation of personnel-identifying incident data pending that review's conclusion. He did not quite meet her eyes when he said it, which told her, more than the notice itself did, that some part of him already suspected what he was actually doing. I want to be clear, this isn't personal, archivist. It's statute. I didn't write it. You're asking me to hand over 6 years of work because a trade consortium 3 systems away got caught selling shipping manifests, Ilyn said, and heard her own voice come out flatter and colder than she'd intended, the particular stillness she'd learned, without meaning to, from watching Reeve Calanth close a hearing. Nobody in this record is named without a documented incident report backing the entry. I'm not selling anything. I'm not compiling anyone's movements. I'm recording what they did in an emergency, on the public record, where anyone with directorate clearance could already find it if they were willing to spend 6 years cross-referencing it themselves. The statute doesn't distinguish motive, archivist. It distinguishes consent. Osk's discomfort didn't stop him from setting the seizure order to auto-execute in 72 hours if she didn't comply voluntarily, because discomfort, Ilyn was beginning to understand, had never once in the history of the Concord been enough on its own to stop a directive from running its course. 72 hours. I'd advise you to begin preparing a compliant, redacted version now, unless you'd rather the review board decide what stays and what doesn't. Coral Bassing heard about it within the hour, and for the first time in the 2 years Ilyn had known him, she watched the old archivist do something other than gently dismantle her footnotes. He went, personally, to the Frontier Division's senior administrator, and came back an hour later with his collar loosened, and a look on his face she'd never seen on him before, not defeat, but the particular grim satisfaction of a man who had just spent every scrap of institutional goodwill he'd banked over 40 careful years, and did not regret it yet. "I told them what I've told you 100 times," he said, dropping into the chair across from her station, "that the record is the most rigorously honest document I've read in 4 decades. I also told them that honesty doesn't matter to a compliance officer executing a 72-hour clock, and that if they let Den Osk delete 6 years of verified incident data, because a statute written for a completely different problem happened to scan the word named in your index, they will have destroyed the only document in this directorate that has ever made a bureau adjudicator change her mind about anything." They were unmoved. "I am, apparently, a sentimental old man defending a scrapbook, in the administrator's own words. I have been called worse by better people, but I'll admit it stung coming from someone who signs my performance review. What happens in 72 hours if I don't comply? They seize the working copy and lock the archive pending review, which in bureau time means somewhere between 18 months and never." Bassing said it without softening it, because softening it, she understood by now, was not a kindness he believed in. You keep your private notes, presumably, if you're careful enough to have backups nobody's thought to ask about. But the record, the cited, cross-referenced, directorate-adjacent version, the one that means anything to anyone who isn't you, that version is gone, until a review board with no particular urgency gets around to deciding whether a 15-year-old's 6 years of work was worth the paperwork of restoring it. You understand what that timeline actually means. She understood it exactly. It meant the record would not exist the next time someone needed it in under 4 minutes. She went to her father that night, in the too-quiet apartment, and told him the whole of it, and watched him go very still in the way he always did when he was doing arithmetic he didn't want to do out loud. Ilyn Dorsa was deputy directorate now, one rank below the administrator Bassing had already spent his goodwill arguing with, and Ilyn understood, watching his face, that whatever he decided to do next would cost him something specific and countable, in a way Bassing's 40 banked years of quiet cooperation had not quite had to. "If I intervene as deputy directorate to overrule a properly filed compliance directive on behalf of my own daughter's private project," Ilyn said slowly, "there is no version of that which does not look exactly like nepotism, whatever the merits of the record actually are. I will be spending real authority to do it. Authority I will not get back for a long time, if ever, and authority I may need later for something I cannot yet predict I'll need it for." He was quiet for a long moment, and Ilyn made herself wait rather than fill the silence for him, because she had learned that too, somewhere in the last 6 years, from watching people who mattered decide things slowly on purpose. "I am going to do it anyway, not because you are my daughter. Because I sat in a gallery at Orun and watched a system nearly kill 11,000 people out of a caution. It never once had to justify against an actual record. And I will not now stand by and let that same system erase the one document built specifically to make it justify itself, over a statute that was never written with you in mind. But Ilyn, I am not going to make this easy for you by breaking the rule outright. That would only teach Osk's superiors that the record survives because of who your father is, and the day I am no longer deputy directorate, it would die anyway for exactly that reason. I am going to buy you time instead. 90 days, not 72 hours. Use them to solve the actual problem, not to hide from it." The actual problem, once she stopped being afraid of it long enough to see it clearly, had an answer that was slower and more honest than a legal loophole would have been. If the statute required consent, she would get consent, one name at a time, from every field worker still living who appeared in the record, and she would strike the rest rather than protect them behind her father's rank. It took the better part of a year, careful, unglamorous letters through proper channels, patient enough that Bassing, watching her draft the 40th one with exactly the same care she'd given the first, finally told her she'd stopped needing his footnotes months ago and simply hadn't noticed. 61 field personnel wrote back and said yes, put my name on what I did, and 4 wrote back and asked her gently to leave them out. And she did without argument, because Juno Hale's oldest lesson, that the record only earned trust if it was willing to lose something for the sake of being honest, had, somewhere in that year, stopped being a lesson and become simply how Ilyn Dorsa built things. Directive 41C's review board, when it finally convened 11 months later, found nothing to seize. There was nothing left in the record that hadn't already been freely, individually offered. By the time Ilyn Dorsa turned 16, she held a junior post in the Concord Archive Directorate's Frontier Division. Earned, not gifted, over 2 years of an apprenticeship she had thrown herself into with an intensity her supervisors found alternately impressive and exhausting, because she had come to it already knowing exactly what kind of archivist she intended to become. Her private log, renamed with rather less childish gravity as the Cross-Sector Anomalous Intervention Record, had grown to 911 verified entries spanning 11 years, cross-referenced against Bureau incident files, casualty statistics, and this had taken her a full year of quiet, patient requests through proper channels, direct correspondence with over 60 open-hand field personnel willing to have their actual names attached to what they'd actually done. It was still not an official Bureau document. It was, by then, impossible for anyone in the Directorate to pretend it was merely a scrapbook. Her direct supervisor in the Frontier Division, a weathered senior archivist named Coral Bassing, who had spent 40 years cataloging Concord incident reports without ever once, by his own cheerful admission, changing a single Bureau policy with any of them, had taken to reading her weekly entries the way some people read serial fiction. Arriving at her small archive station each cycle with 2 cups of steeped leaf and a list of objections, he clearly enjoyed raising more than he expected her to survive. Entry 881, he said, one such morning, tapping the display. You've attributed the Corvassi drift outcome to the field team's improvisation. I'd argue the authorities' own delayed evacuation order bought them the extra 6 minutes that made the improvisation possible at all. You've buried the authorities' contribution in a footnote. I'll revise the footnote. You'll revise it into the body text, Dorsa, or I'll flag the whole entry as advocacy rather than record, and you know I will, because I've done it to you 11 times already this year. He said it without heat, the way a man states the weather. You are building the most rigorously honest document I have read in 4 decades in this division, and you are still, every single time, one editorial pass away from letting your affection for your source get the better of your footnotes. Fix it. Then it'll survive someone who wants it to be wrong. She fixed it. She fixed nearly everything he flagged over those 2 years, because his objections were nearly always right, and because she had come to understand, watching him work, that Bassing's decades of quietly unread reports were not a failure of imagination the way she'd have judged them at 9. They were the discipline that made her own record trustworthy to people who owed her nothing. It was Bassing, in the end, who filed the request that got her posted to Meridian Vault for the long drift transit at all, with a recommendation letter that used the word meticulous 4 times, and the word promising not once, because, he told her, promising was a word for archivists who hadn't proven anything yet, and she had stopped being one of those a long time before he'd started signing her performance reviews. She was stationed that year aboard Meridian Vault, a drift habitat of 211,000 souls, one of the Concord's largest deep space population centers, built across 4 generations around a gravitic drive core that had, until recently, been considered one of the most reliable pieces of engineering in Concord space. She had been assigned there for the Vault's scheduled transit of the long drift, a debris field notorious enough that the crossing required 6 months of preparation and produced, every cycle, exactly the kind of dense incident record her division existed to maintain. Juno Hale, 31 now, silver already threading in at her temples, commanded the Open Hands' largest field team in the sector, and had been contracted, under the restricted, bureau-supervised authority Reeve Callant's ruling had left her, to provide auxiliary structural support during the vault's transit, a role that amounted in practice to standing by with her hands mostly tied, unless something went wrong badly enough to trigger an emergency override clause nobody expected to actually use. Reeve Callanth, now senior adjudicator for the sector, was aboard the vault to oversee the transit's bureau compliance directly, a fact Ilyn had learned 2 days before the crossing began and had spent most of those 2 days trying, and failing, not to think about. They had not spoken since the Oron hearing, and when they finally did, in a directorate corridor 2 days before the transit, both of them there early for entirely unrelated reasons, it was Callanth who stopped walking first. Archivist Dorsa, she said the title carefully, the way a person tests a word they are not yet sure they believe. I read the cross-sector anomalous intervention record's full current form last month, 900 entries at the time. I understand it is closer to 910 now. 911, Ilyn said, as of this morning. I do not agree with all of your methodology. Several of your causal attributions in the earlier entries are generous to the intervening party in ways a stricter reviewer would flag. Callanth's pale eyes did not waver. I also could not, in good conscience, find a single entry across the full record where your sourcing was dishonest, incomplete without disclosure, or shaped to fit a conclusion you had already decided on before you gathered the evidence. That is rarer than you may understand, archivist, in documents built by people with an outcome they wanted to be true. I did not expect to be able to say that about a record kept by someone who began it, by her own foreword, out of an argument with a corridor. I began it because a woman crouched down and asked me what I'd seen, instead of telling me to go back to my modules, Ilyn said. I don't know that it would have become anything otherwise. Perhaps not. Callanth considered that, in the unhurried way she considered everything, and for a moment something almost rueful moved behind the careful composure. I have spent a great deal of my career believing that caution and imagination were opposites, archivist, that the discipline of the manual was what protected people from the appeal of a clever story. Your record is the first evidence I have encountered that suggests they might instead be the same instinct, applied at different points in an emergency. I have not decided what to do with that yet. I mention it only so that, if this transit produces a situation in which your record and my authority are on opposite sides of a decision, you will understand that I am not your enemy in it. I am simply not yet convinced I am wrong to need more than a good story before I bend a rule that exists, because people died building it. That's all I've ever wanted anyone to be, Ilyn said, not convinced by a story. Convinced by the record. Callanth studied her for one more moment, then continued down the corridor without further comment, and Ilyn stood there a while longer than she needed to, turning the exchange over, before she went back to the transit monitoring post, and the 6 months of preparation still ahead of the crossing that neither of them yet knew would end with the two of them on opposite ends of a countdown clock. The long drift transit went wrong on its 3rd hour, when a debris fragment too small for the vault's forward sensors to flag in time struck a secondary containment coil on the gravitic drive core at precisely the angle needed to seed a resonance cascade through the primary field. A failure mode so specific, so dependent on an unlucky convergence of debris trajectory and drive harmonics, that it did not appear anywhere in the Bureau's certified emergency procedures for vault-class habitats. Because no one had ever built a procedure for a failure, the Bureau's own engineers had rated as statistically negligible. By the time the alarms reached Ilyn's station in the Archive Directorate's transit monitoring post, the cascade had already begun eating outward through the drive core's containment lattice, and the vault's automated safety systems, built, like every Concord safety system, to trust the certified model over an anomalous reading, had responded exactly as designed, initiating a staged evacuation of the outer habitation rings closest to the core, and locking the core itself into an emergency shutdown sequence that would, in 11 minutes, either successfully isolate the cascade or, if the isolation failed, trigger a controlled core ejection that would save the vault's population at the cost of severing 40% of its structure, including the ring holding the vault's water reclamation systems, its primary medical bay, and 11,000 residents who would not make it to the outer evacuation shelters in 11 minutes. Ilyn was in the emergency command gallery 6 minutes later, technically present in an archival capacity, watching a review of exactly the kind of decision her entire record existed to document, when Juno Hale's voice came through the command channel requesting emergency override authority to attempt a direct intervention on the containment lattice. "Denied," said the shift commander, a harried Cassar officer named Perrin asked, not unkindly but flatly, reading from the same certified logic that had governed every decision Ilyn had spent 11 years documenting the exceptions to. "Ms. Hale, the core ejection protocol is rated, tested, and will save 200,000 lives in the next 11 minutes if we let it run. I am not authorizing an unrated intervention on an active resonance cascade with that many lives already secured by a working protocol. The protocol saves 200,000 people and kills 11,000 who don't need to die," Juno said, and Ilyn, watching through the gallery glass, could hear in her voice the particular flat urgency of someone who had made this exact argument, in one form or another, more times across more crises than anyone in that room could imagine. "I've read the cascade's resonance signature off your own sensor feed for the last 90 seconds. It's not spreading evenly through the lattice. It's concentrating along the coil that took the impact, the way a stress fracture concentrates along a weld seam instead of propagating clean. If I can get a counter-resonance dampener seated on that coil in the next 4 minutes, I can arrest the cascade before core ejection triggers, and you keep the ring, the medical bay, and the 11,000 people your protocol is about to write off as an acceptable loss." Reeve Calanth, standing at the gallery's central console with her hands folded behind her back in a stillness Ilyn recognized from 2 years earlier in a different gallery, spoke before Commander Ask could answer. "Ms. Hale's proposal is precisely the category of intervention my ruling restricted," Calanth said. "An unrated device, seated by hand, against an active cascade, with no certified precedent for success. Kessin Drift was 11 lives. This is potentially 211,000 if the intervention destabilizes the cascade further instead of arresting it. I will not authorize this." It was, Ilyn understood later, the exact moment her whole life had been quietly assembling itself toward, though it did not feel like destiny in the moment. It felt like her pulse going hard and flat in her ears and her hands, entirely without her permission, already pulling up the archive interface on the console in front of her. "Adjudicator," her voice cracked on the word and she made herself steady it. "You have the authority to invoke emergency review under Bureau Charter Section 41, which permits deviation from standing restriction when a credentialed archivist can demonstrate documented precedent of comparable success under comparable failure conditions. I am a credentialed archivist of this directorate. I am invoking it." Calanth turned to look at her, really look, the way she had looked at Ilyn once before across a hearing room gallery, except this time Ilyn was not an uncredentialed 14-year-old with no standing to be there. "On what precedent, Archivist Dorsa?" Ilyn threw the record onto the main display with hands that were shaking, and did not stop moving anyway. 911 documented incidents, cross-referenced against Bureau casualty data, spanning 11 years. 43 of them are containment or structural cascade failures with a comparable resonance concentration signature to what your own sensors are reading right now. In 39 of those 43, a hand-seeded counterintervention succeeded where a certified automated protocol would have produced significantly higher losses. I have the casualty comparison run for each one, verified against the Bureau's own after-action reports, not mine. In 4 of the 43, the intervention failed and losses were comparable to the certified protocol's baseline. 0 of the 43 produced losses worse than the automated protocol would have produced on its own. That is not luck, adjudicator. That is 11 years of pattern, and I built the record you're looking at specifically because I believed, one day, someone in a room like this one would need it in less than 4 minutes. The gallery was silent, not the silence of an argument one, but the silence of a room doing arithmetic. It had never been forced to do that fast before. Commander Ask looked at the display, at the resonance signature scrolling live beside Ilyn's 39 comparable cases, at the clock counting down toward core ejection. Reeve Calanth looked at none of it for a long moment. She looked at Ilyn. "You have been building this record since you were 9 years old," Calanth said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. I called it inconvenient once without ever using that word to your face. I called your team's success luck." Calanth's pale eyes did not leave Ilyn's, and something in them, not defeat, something closer to the specific vertigo of a person watching 11 years of their own certainty get set calmly, on a table in front of them, moved and did not look away. 3 minutes, 40 seconds to core ejection, Commander. Archivist Dorsa's invocation is procedurally valid. I am authorizing Ms. Hale's intervention under emergency review, on the archivist's documented precedent, and I am doing so understanding that if she is wrong, the record will show that I was the one who let a girl's data slate outrank 200 years of Bureau caution. Move. Juno did not wait for the sentence to finish. She was already moving, her team's counter-resonance dampener, an ugly, improvised-looking rig that Ilyn recognized, with a jolt, as built from exactly the kind of unrated scrap alloy ingenuity she'd first watched welded to a coolant manifold 11 years and 1 lifetime ago, already primed on a magnetic tether line toward the drive core's outer access hatch. "Talk to me," Juno said, over the open channel, and it took Ilyn a full second to understand the words were meant for her. "Archivist, you've read all 39 of those cases closer than anyone alive except me. I need the coil seeding sequence from the one that's closest to this signature, Corvassi drift, 4 years back, the one with the double impact debris strike. Walk me through it while I'm in the access tunnel. I don't have hands free to pull the file myself." For the length of 3 minutes and 11 seconds, Ilyn Dorsa did the thing she had spent 11 years, without ever quite admitting it to herself, training to be able to do. She read a case file aloud in a voice that did not shake, translating a decade-old incident report into a live sequence of instructions. Coil seating angle, dampener charge timing, the precise half-second delay between contact and activation that had made the difference, in the Corvassi case, between a cascade arrested and a cascade merely slowed. While on the far side of a magnetic tether line, in a drive core tunnel filling slowly with the ozone stink of a resonance field going unstable. Juno Hale seated an ugly improvised device against a coil, exactly where an archive built from a 9-year-old stress gauge, and a decade of stubborn, unglamorous documentation told her it needed to go. At the 2-minute mark, the dampener's first seeding attempt slipped, a half-centimeter drift off the coil's true axis that would have meant nothing on a stable surface and meant, on a housing already humming with resonance stress, that the charge would discharge into empty air instead of the coil itself. "It's not seeding," Juno said, and for the first time since the alarms had sounded there was something in her voice that was not quite steady. "Risers higher than your Corvassi case, archivist. I'm sitting proud of the coil face by 0.5 centimeter, and I don't have room in this tunnel to reposition, without losing my charge window. Ilyn's hands went cold on the console, and for one long half-second, the 11 years of the record threatened to collapse into exactly the kind of story Reeve Calanth had spent her whole career distrusting. A clever pattern that worked 95% of the time, failing on the one occasion it was asked to hold the most weight it would ever hold. Then she made herself do the only thing she actually knew how to do, which was look at the record instead of the fear. The Corvette coil had a manufacturing tolerance stamp on the housing rim, Class 2, Ilyn said, pulling the schematic up so fast her own hands blurred. If Meridian Vault's core was retrofitted from the original spec, the way Kelson's Reach's support brace was check the housing rim for a tolerance stamp. There should be a lip half a centimeter proud of the original design exactly where you're reading the drift. You're not misjudging the seat. The seat moved. Shim the dampener's contact face off the lip instead of the coil, and you'll be flush again. 3 seconds of silence over the open channel, filled with nothing but the ozone hiss of a resonance field still climbing. Then, lips there. Copy shimming off the lip. A grunt of effort, metal on metal, the specific scrape of an improvised fix meeting an unglamorous-shaped problem. Seated, charging. The cascade's resonance reading spiked once, violently, on the main display. A spike that made Commander Ask's hand hover over the ejection trigger with 14 seconds left on the countdown. And then broke, all at once, into a falling curve that leveled out into the flat, uneventful hum of a contained system. Core ejection did not trigger. The ring held. 11,000 people who had, 4 minutes earlier, been an acceptable loss inside a certified protocol's arithmetic, kept breathing recycled vault air in a medical bay that stayed exactly where it was. The formal inquiry into the long drift incident took 4 months, and unlike the Oran shipyard's hearing 11 years, no, Ilyn corrected herself, 2 years earlier, though it felt like a different lifetime entirely. This one did not end in a restriction. It ended in the first Bureau-sanctioned revision to Concord Emergency Structural Protocol in 30 years, formally incorporating hand-seated counter-resonance intervention as a certified secondary procedure for cascade failures exhibiting concentrated resonance signatures, cited directly, by number, by date, by name, against the cross-sector anomalous intervention record. Archivist Ilyn Dorsa, principal compiler. 39 referenced case entries, verified, and entered into permanent bureau record. Reeve Calanth, in the closing session, did something Ilyn had not expected and would not, for the rest of her life, entirely stop being moved by. She stood in front of the full review panel and read 11 of the record's 43 cascade entries aloud herself, by name, including the 4 where the intervention had failed, because, she said, a record only earned trust if the people citing it were willing to say its failures out loud along with its successes. And she said that the Bureau's caution had not been wrong to exist, only wrong to assume it was the only kind of caution worth building, and that the Frontier Division's own archivist had, over 11 quiet, unglamorous years, built the thing the Bureau should have built decades earlier, and had simply never had the humility to think it needed. Calanth did not lose her post. She kept it, and used it in the 2 years that followed to sponsor the Bureau Charter's first formal partnership framework with the open hand, restricted still, supervised still, because the Concord did not change its whole architecture overnight for one archivist and one relief team, but real, cited, and no longer erasable. The news reached past the Concord's own borders within the season, relayed through neutral trade networks, picked up by independent broadcast services that answered to no single polity, told and retold across systems that had never heard of Kelson's Reach or Oran shipyards, or a 9-year-old girl with a stress gauge clipped to her belt, until the story of the human relief teams who argued with dying manuals and usually, not always but usually, won, had become the kind of thing traders repeated at neutral docks, the way old spacers repeated stories about ships that shouldn't have survived their own launches. It was not, yet, A legend in the way the old myths were legends, complete and finished and safe in the past tense. It was still being written, one incident at a time, by people who mostly never expected to be believed. But it had a name attached to it now, and a record and a girl, a woman nearly, though she still thought of herself sometimes as the child in the duct, who had refused for 11 years to let it stay a scrapbook. 6 weeks after the inquiry closed, on a maintenance dock aboard Meridian Vault that smelled, faintly and permanently, of recycled air and machine oil, Ilyn Dorsa found Juno Hale exactly where she'd expected to find her, kneeling beside a supply crate, running a diagnostic on the same ugly improvised dampener rig that had held a drive core cascade still with 14 seconds to spare. Patching a hairline stress crack in its casing, with a bead of scrap alloy weld laid down, with the same unhurried precision Ilyn had watched from a service great a lifetime ago. "You're going to run out of things to fix eventually," Ilyn said, sitting down on the crate beside her, the record's interface still open on the slate in her hands out of a habit that had become, by now, closer to a second heartbeat than a job. "No," Juno said, not looking up from the weld. "That's the one thing I can promise you never happens." She finished the seam, set the welder down and looked at her properly, really looked, the way she had 11 years earlier in a corridor, cataloging everything in under a second and this time finding, Ilyn thought, something different in what she cataloged. "You did the thing I told you to do. Argued with it when it mattered. You told me to keep watching through ducts. I told you a lot of things you apparently actually listened to, which frankly nobody warns you can happen with a kid." Juno reached over without much ceremony and tapped a knuckle against the worn stress gauge still clipped, 11 years and one entire archived life later to Ilyn's belt. 16 years old and a bureau charter's got your name on it forever now. 911 entries. You built an actual thing, Ilyn, not a story about one. A thing other people are going to have to stand on, whether they like it or not. Ilyn looked down at the record on her slate, at the clean-cited entries that had, 6 weeks ago, been a 9-year-old's private scrapbook, and were now, permanently, load-bearing, the kind of true that survived a bureau finding, exactly as her father had told her it would need to be, back when she'd been too angry and too young to believe it could actually happen. "Show me what humans can do," she said again, quietly, not really a question this time, closer to a private joke between the two of them and the 11 years that had passed since the first time she'd asked it. "That's what I said to you, on the dock. I didn't know what I was actually asking." "You didn't need to know yet." Juno stood, offered a hand down, and pulled Ilyn up off the crate with the same unbothered ease she'd once used to hand a curious 9-year-old a stress gauge in a quiet corridor. "You just needed to keep asking it long enough to find out." She picked up the repaired dampener rig, slung it over one shoulder, and started back down the dock toward whatever the next crisis would turn out to be, because there was always going to be a next one, and looked back once, the way she had 11 years earlier at a junction in Kelson's Reach. "Your turn now," Juno said. "Show me what you can do." Ilyn Dorsa closed the record, clipped the stress gauge more securely to her belt, and followed her down the dock.